All right, hello class. Today we're going to go over U.S. regions. Okay? And the definitions that I'm using are from the U.S. Census Bureau. Okay? So sometimes determining what region a state is in can be somewhat contentious. Some people have pretty strong opinions on this. I'm just going to defer to the U.S. Census Bureau even when I think they don't make a ton of sense. So let's begin. So the first one that they have as a broad region is the Northeast, okay, which is highlighted here in red. So what they consider to be part of the Northeast is Connecticut, Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Vermont. So if we take that as the Northeast, okay, as a matter of area, they're a rather small part of the United States. Only 5% of the area of the United States. However, 57, almost 58 million people, that's 17% of the population. And that's because there are some pretty important cities to the United States that help give the Northeast their culture. And so, perhaps the most famous city in the entire world, clearly the most famous city in the Northeast, is New York City in New York. Now, as a city population, if you put all 5 boroughs together, it's 8.8 million people. But if you look at the New York Metro, which extends, the metropolitan area extends past just the state of New York, it's around 20 million people. Okay? And so, as a business and cultural center, very impactful. Another one we can have is Philadelphia in the state of Pennsylvania. And so, for its city population, it is one of the 10 largest in the United States. It has 1.6 million people. Again, its metro population is much larger, 6.2 million. And then another one where these metropolitan areas that span multiple states can be more impactful than the city might indicate just based on its population. So that's Boston. Okay, so as a like part of like a cultural heritage, if you think back to the Revolution, the things that are leading up to it with the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, right? We have Boston, Massachusetts. So the city of Boston itself, 676,000 people, but it has a metro population of nearly 5 million. That is extending out past just Massachusetts. It's going into New Hampshire. And so we have these big metropolitan areas. The Northeast is the area that has the highest population density of any region in the United States. So when it comes to their politics, this is in the current day an overwhelmingly democratic place on the presidential level. We look at 2020. There was only one electoral vote that Donald Trump got, and that was from a congressional district in Maine, Maine being one of 2 states, besides Nebraska, that splits their electoral votes based on congressional district. But if they didn't do it, it would have been a clean sweep for Biden. Now you have Pennsylvania, that is an actual swing state, but besides Pennsylvania, none of these other states have had a Republican presidential candidate win it in the last 20 years. Now, historically, this wasn't a very strong area for the Republican Party. A big unionist sentiment. And so sometimes you still see that with like Vermont being the state that gave Joe Biden its largest percentage. It has a Republican governor, a rather liberal Republican governor, but this is part of that heritage. All right, then you have the South. And the Census Bureau does divide the South into like 3 different sections, but take it as a whole, this is the South, according to the Census Bureau. So it's a very wide selection of things. Alabama, Arkansas, Delaware, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maryland, Mississippi, North Carolina, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Virginia, and West Virginia. So 25% of U.S. area is the South, but 38% of the U.S. population is in the South. And that is because the second and third most populated states are in the South, Texas and Florida. And this is something where air conditioning has played a huge role here. Compared to how much percentage of the U.S. population was in Florida and Texas in 1900 versus 2000, it's a huge difference. These are states that are still having big booms and growth, and that is because of stuff like air conditioning is allowing it there. But it's fast-growing region. Now, it's kind of hard to identify the South, so this is why the heritage of the Confederacy comes into play. Right? The Confederate States of America, those that rebelled during the Civil War. Of the states that are considered part of the South by the Census Bureau, it includes every state that was part of the Confederacy. It also includes 4 states that were border states. Okay, the outlier here is they consider Missouri part of the Midwest, and Oklahoma was not a state at that point. Actually had to do with Native American, the Americans having that land at that point. But this is where it plays into it, where it does seem kind of weird for Delaware to be included in the South, but it was a place that had slavery. It had segregation pretty late into history, like President Biden, when he was a kid and he moved to Delaware, they still segregated schools. So that's part of the heritage there. However, again, you're seeing this big growth as people are moving down south. And so we're looking at the cities. Texas could have its own list. Okay, so this is just their actual population, not just the metro area, because some of these bleed into each other. Houston, 2.3 million people. San Antonio, 1.5 million people. Dallas, 1.3 million people. Austin, when I made this at 965,000 people, it's growing enough. It may have hit 1 million by the time I post this video. Now, Florida has a bunch of influential cities, but its largest one is actually Jacksonville, which has a city population of 950,000 people and a metro of 1.73 million. Now, if we're looking for some other places in the South, a place like Oklahoma City, the capital of Oklahoma, 690,000 people, but it has a metro 1.5 million. And then you can go to like Charlotte in North Carolina, 875,000 people in the city. It's a metro area of 2.66 million. And Atlanta is perhaps the best example of why the city limits and the metropolitan area, which one you should use at different times. Atlanta itself, 500,000 people. Okay? But it has a huge booming metro area of 6 million. So when it comes to politics, historically, following the Civil War, following Reconstruction, the South was the base of the Democratic Party. Okay? And this is something that has changed across time, but there are still vestiges of this that you can find. Kentucky and Louisiana still have Democratic governors. But on the presidential level, it has, especially in the last 30 years, gone almost entirely to the Republican side. Virginia is having the metropolitan area around Washington, D.C. In Northern Virginia, it's growing, so it's shifting in the other direction. And then Georgia, with its booming Atlanta metro, just barely flipped to Biden in 2020. And they both have Republican governors right now. These can be competitive states. So again, there was one point in which the South was just dead set Democratic, and the North was basically dead set Republican. And it hasn't been a complete flip, but things change across time. There's just so many more people living there now. Then you have where I live, which is the Midwest. Okay, and people can have very specific ideas of what is part of the Midwest. This is what the Census Bureau says is the Midwest. Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, North Dakota, Ohio, South Dakota, Wisconsin. Okay, so Midwest is its own region, and this is what the Census Bureau considers it to be part of. Now, the Midwest kind of hits it perfect here. Around 20% of the nation's land area in the Midwest, around 21% of the nation's population is in the Midwest. So this, fits about a fifth of both things there. Now, if we're looking at what are some significant cities in the Midwest, unfortunately, none of them are going to be from my home state of Iowa, but you have Chicago. So Illinois, it is the third largest city in the United States, 2.75 million people. Its metro population, almost 10 million in Chicago. We have in Michigan, we have Detroit. So Detroit is one that had more historical significance. At one point, Detroit had over 1 million people in its area, and it's had some significant declines. Less than the metro, though, which is still pretty significant there, but seems this place of automotive manufacturing, even if we've seen that decline. There's Minneapolis, which is part of the Twin Cities, right? So there's St. Paul right next to it, and they're basically there together. So Minneapolis, it's 430,000 people, but its metro population is 3.7 million. It's right next to the state capital, St. Paul, growing out there in Minnesota. St. Louis is another thing that's somewhat similar to Detroit. But at one point, St. Louis had like 800,000 people, but its city has continuously declined for about the last 70 years. But still, if you look at the historical significance, the Gateway Arch, gateway to the west, metro population 2.82 million. So when it comes to politics, the Midwest is basically the most competitive of any of these regions. Okay, and so I'm talking about the 2020 election. And so in this here, Biden won several of these states and a lot of the electoral votes. However, former President Trump also was very competitive here. And, Iowa and Ohio, though they went for former President Trump, highly contested on both sides, whereas like Wisconsin and Michigan had just flipped back. So this is a place that is, some areas of it are highly competitive compared to like the Dakotas, Nebraska, and Kansas. These are not been competitive for Democrats for about 60 years. Last bit is the West, which the Census Bureau does break down into further amounts than just this. This is basically what they consider the West is the rest. Alaska, Arizona, California, Colorado, Hawaii, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, New Mexico, Oregon, Utah, Washington, and Wyoming. So the West contains 49% of the land area of the United States. And it contains 24% of the population of the United States. So again, about half of the land, about a quarter of the people. And it contains the most populous state and the geographically largest states. So California is the most populous state by a good margin. And there are cities in California that are not even that well known that you could plop them in another state and they'd be the biggest city. But if you're looking at just the metros, Okay, this is the metros. Like Los Angeles, 13 million people. San Francisco, almost 5 million people. San Diego, 3.3 million. San Jose, 2 million. All in the same state. For Arizona, we have Phoenix, which its city population is 1.6 million, but it is just surrounded by all of these suburbs and a metropolitan area of almost 5 million. Seattle in Washington, you see the Space Needle, 700,000 people, but a 4 million people in their metro population. Denver, another growing area, 715,000 people in the city itself, metro population of 3 million. So here, currently, the politics is kind of split based on where you're at. So, like, since 1992, you have places like Washington, Oregon, California that have all gone for a Democrat every single time. Then you have places like New Mexico that in 2004 voted for George W. Bush. And then we have states like Colorado and Nevada that have been trending Democratic across time. Since Obama won them in 2008, they've been in those hands. And then you have places like Wyoming, which is the most Republican state in the nation, basically, in the mountains. So if you just like take the electoral votes together, it is overwhelmingly Democratic, but it does heavily depend state to state on the West, and even within the states themselves, there can be pretty significant differences. All right, so that's what I have on the U.S. regions for geography class. I would love to hear people's opinions on what the U.S. Census Bureau has considered for these regions. Should they change them? Are some of these definitions outdated? Are there many significant cities in these areas that I forgot to talk about?